Good afternoon. All right, so I'm going to get your names down. So today we're doing the handout, the assignment on Woodrow Wilson and his idealism versus his behavior as our president. Uh, he is one of the couple presidents. Another one I think of is Thomas Jefferson. When you look at his rhetoric, like what he claimed to stand for and what he wrote and what he spoke, and then you look at that in light of what he did and didn't do as president, and you find some contradictions, you find some ironies, right? So of course, as you might guess, you have contentions that people change with power, right? That perhaps they became in some ways drunk with power, more conservative in age. You have the contention, right, that circumstances that circumstances almost in their minds necessitated uh, a different stance on certain issues, and that's basically what we're looking at today, right? In this handout, is that latter one. So note, right, Woodrow Wilson ran for president in 1912. He had been successfully a Princeton professor, the dean of Princeton, the governor of New Jersey. Already as the governor of New Jersey, and as well as an intellectual, we saw what a broad blanket this is, but he claimed to be a progressive, right, in light of this progressive movement that was going on. And so hence, he shared the anti-big business rhetoric, right, with progressives, thinking that, the whole countervailing balance theory, that different factions in society weigh a certain amount at different times, and that the big business in particular had become way too heavy in comparison to any other factions, including the government itself at every level. And so hence they needed to counterbalance that weight, right, by giving more voice to the people, and also more empowerment, regulatory empowerment to the federal government and other levels of government, right, to balance it out. So he was pretty consistently anti-big business in his rhetoric. What I find interesting, however, right, is in many ways his rhetoric was steeped in kind of Whiggish liberalism, right? Remember the Whig, WHIG party in England, and then later on here in the U.S., but mainly in England in the Whig tradition, right? Is in many cases they were somewhat libertarian, right? They wanted no big brother intervening in their business. They wanted, kind of laissez-faire capitalism. Everyone let the economy do its thing, and let there be access to the American dream or socioeconomic ascendance for everyone, right? Let there be as little intrusion of the government in personal lives as possible, etc. And we talked about, however, that one thing that many of the progressives shared was a willingness to have bigger government get involved in the economy, right? Because they felt like the capitalist system was too Darwinian, that where it just allowed the big guys to just gobble up the little guys, and there was something inherently unfair and inherently unhealthy about that, right? And so to me, he kind of toted that line from what I've read of his writings, etc. Is in some ways he was kind of a Whig, and in other ways he was pro bigger government, but always right with the same alleged goals, is for the optimal freedom of the individual and the optimal economic opportunities for all individuals, right, within a capitalist and Republican society. And I don't mean Republican Party; I mean Republican form of government, right? So, at any rate, when you look at that, right, with number one is look for evidence that his his what we're just talking about, his political leanings, his academic tenure as a professor and dean, that those made him disposed to leaning in sympathy toward the Triple Entente, the allies, okay, of England, France, and Russia, especially when Russia came out of it, out of the war with the Bolshevik Revolution, and they had just England and France, right? Because you look at the other side, Okay. And you could make the argument that the other side represented in some ways in his mind the opposite, the antithesis of his Whig and liberal values, right? So in World War One, I hope that you guys had a chance or do have a chance in the future to look at my general introduction. Very, very minimal and basic. I'm sure you could find a much better detailed, in-depth introduction than that. I wrote that relatively quickly, but it just covers the basics, right? Of supposedly what led the major European powers to war, right? And for instance, oftentimes they say diplomacy, imperialism, nationalism, right? Imperialism versus nationalism, right? You had these multinational empires that impose their will on these colonial societies, right? Against their will, obviously, impose their will upon them. And then, as a league of concert amongst the European powers, they agreed and said, "Okay, you take this country, I'll take that one," right? And an example of that, supposedly, there's an anecdote of the German representative telling the French, "Are you still smarting? Are you still angry over Alsace and Lorraine being taken from you, being taken from France by Germany?" He says, "Here, go ahead and take the ripe fruit of Tunisia." As if Tunisia in North Africa were the Germans to give, right? That's the kind of hubris, the arrogance that these European powers had during the early 1900s. Remember the imperialism handout that we did. Remember the types of ideas that were percolating: social Darwinism, Malthus, too many people and not enough resources, right? Geopolitics. You got to fight for key strategic areas on the globe and not take no for an answer, right? Alfred Thayer Mahan, you got to have key points out on the ocean of strategic and material value and naval value for the almost inevitable wars that are going to happen, right? Nietzsche, that society become too soft and need to go back to its almost kind of primitive and militaristic roots. And so those types of ideas were still percolating, right? And then when you had the second industrial revolution mainly embraced and taken off in Europe, in Western Europe, and in the United States, that just enhanced, arguably, their arrogance, right? That enhanced their sense of superiority and saying, "See, these notions that are percolating in academia and in the newspapers and in books, right, are just validated by the facts that you're seeing here. We're clearly, leagues ahead of sub-Saharan Africa, right, of East Asia, right, because by the late 1800s, you'd already had the Opium Wars and people carving up China against her will, right, and so China is having kind of a nadir, a fall in her power historically, right, in East Asia. And so, and by the way, remember, you have historians like Andre Gunder Frank and others who contend the East was way ahead of the West, arguably at least up through the 16, even 1700s. And so it's arguable when, but no longer that arguable in the early 1900s. Clearly, Western Europe and the United States, technologically, industrially, militarily, right, are ahead and are taking advantage of um, that superiority, if you will, at that time period over other quote developing countries, right? And we talked about that with overseas imperialism in the Caribbean and in the Philippines, et cetera, right, with the Spanish American War and all that. So now that all that has been going on, like I said, you had fights over the Baghdad Railroad. I mean, as if Baghdad was Russia's and France's to have, right? You had fights over Morocco with the Germans trying to kick the French out. But what about the Moroccans, right? It was as if they were just passive recipients of what was going on. They were not invited to these political, synods, these meetings where they in councils where they would make decisions as to who had sovereignty over what land. The people in these developing countries didn't have a say. In the 1890s, in the first decade of the 1900s, supposedly every sub-Saharan African country was at least partially colonized, with the exception of Ethiopia or Abyssinia. Africa was being quote carved up by England, France, Belgium, right? The Netherlands, etc. So at any rate, um, you see these international powers, right, imposing their will over other peoples. And they didn't just do it on other continents, they did it in their own region as well, right? These multinational, multi-ethnic empires. So for instance, right, you think of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And my goodness, right, you can learn about the Habsburg family and this empire, the dual monarchy and so forth, centuries prior to this. So this is an age-old empire ruled by off and on a single family dynasty, the Habsburgs, right? And they largely, right, it was known as a dual monarchy. The Austrians, who were Germanic and Catholic, and very kind of, like I said, Germanic, very kind of European and white and Catholic in culture, with a Germanic language and Germanic culture. They somewhat shared a monarchy with the Hungarians, the old Magyars, right, the Magyar aristocracy. And so they had nothing even close to a representative parliament. They had no systems of checks and balances with the emperor, etc. They didn't even really have an equivalent for an independent prime minister or chancellor. It was pretty archaic. It was pretty old school, this Austro-Hungarian Empire. And my goodness, they had all the people in the Balkans, right? Well, they're going to actually. But prior to that, the Bohemians, the Czechs, the those beginning to go into the Balkans, the Romanians and Bulgarians, and all these other peoples, right? The Croatians tended to be Catholic. The Albanians were often Muslim. The Serbians were often Eastern Orthodox in their religion. So all these different languages, like at one given time, for instance, there in the Balkans alone, the Ottoman Empire put up edicts, right? And they would have to put them into nearly 90 languages, and so very multi-ethnic and multicultural. All right, but those people, that some of them that I mentioned, right, they were not represented. They were not well represented or represented at all in their territory. Right, it was imposed upon them by these multinational empires like the dual monarchy known as Austria-Hungary. And so then you also had the Ottoman Empire, right? And the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire. I mean, my goodness, right? I think of the first thing I think of happened in what, 1453, when Mehmed the Conqueror took Constantinople, right, from the Eastern Orthodox, the Byzantine Empire. They're in the Bosporus between Turkey and Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean. That's 1453. That's a long time ago. And so the Ottoman Empire was very old. They still had a sultan, and that seemed like from a bygone era, right, where the sultan was kind of the interpreter of the Hadith and of the Quran, the religious leader, almost like the Pope and the emperor in one. They did not have a representative body that passed legislation that had checks and balances with the Sultan by any means. They didn't have a competing chancellor, prime minister, right? And they didn't have any popular elections and referendum that were passed out. Neither did Austria-Hungary. And so, when you add the religious component to it, and the Ottoman Empire by the late 1800s was beginning to look especially archaic, because some components of technology and of the Industrial Revolution, literally the Sultan had declared to be of the devil, and they were not to embrace it. So that's just one of many reasons that both of these empires began to gain a reputation for being somewhat paper tigers by this time, right? That people like elderly empires that had once had a very powerful heyday, but that had long gone, right? And their pretensions were much higher than their actual capacity to uphold those pretensions. But nevertheless, right, they claimed other people's lands. So the Ottoman Empire, from the longest time, from the Crusades, had Palestine or Israel, right, and the entire Levant in the Near East. Needless to say, North Africa, right, as well as Turkey, their homeland, and also into the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, and in the Greek-speaking and Albanian and Croatian areas, etc., in South Central Europe into the Mediterranean. So these are the type of countries that formed the Central Powers: the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Germany. Now, Germany, of course, right, could say, well, we have a Reichstag, we have a parliament, right? We also have a chancellor, somewhat of a president, right? However, right, in France, for instance, and these other countries in Western Europe and England, the majority party in parliament that was elected to parliament, right? The majority parliament, the majority party from the elections got to choose its prime minister, right? And in the case of Germany, the prime minister or the chancellor was handpicked by the emperor, by the Kaiser, who happened to be a young man. And they ascribe that, just like they do in the War for Independence with George III of England. They ascribe his youth as a causal factor, and that he was filled with testosterone, and that it had something to do with his prideful policies, right? Kaiser Wilhelm or William II, right? And so they had a handpicked chancellor who could be scrapped, and a new one could be chosen at the will and the whim of the Kaiser, of the emperor. And the Reichstag, right, was arguably still run and controlled, at least in popular opinion, by the upper house of Junkers. It's spelled like Junkers, Junkers. And the Junker class were an old school aristocratic gentry class that based their wealth on land ownership, on some form of like serfdom labor that they had people on their plantations work. And so they were not connected to that which was new and novel, the Industrial Revolution. By the time of Nazi Germany, some of the Junkers were connected to new big industries, but arguably not so much yet. And so they were seen as an old school, archaic class that dominated the Reichstag. So, at any rate, when Woodrow Wilson looked at these central powers, right, he saw them engaging in imperialism against countries that did not want their influence and their power over them, right? He saw them as not being fair and democratic and representative of their own people and their own lands, right? That they were very aristocratic. I remember Aristoi means the best in Greek, and so you have a kind of a self-appointed elite that contends that they are worthy of leadership alone, right? And of the lion's share of power and opportunities, etc., in their proper countries. So arguably, right, grading on a curve, you look at England and France, and they had multi-party parliamentary systems with checks and balances. They had, popularly elected, in the sense of the most popularly elected party of parliament, prime ministers or presidents, right? In the case of England, already arguably the crown of England was somewhat of a figurehead already by then, right? Long past the Glorious Revolution and all that stipulated that Parliament was supreme and the rule of law will rule England, not the whim of a king or queen, right? And so when you look at all that, right, look for all that in number one is saying that Woodrow Wilson never was truly impartial. That in his heart, in his academic mind, right, that he clearly wanted the triple entente of England, France, and Russia to win, right? That he saw them definitely at least as a lesser evil, and he has direct quotes, right, in which he contends that there would be catastrophic consequences if the Central Powers won, because to him everything that he held dear as a progressive and as a liberal would be at stake, right? Because then more and more corners of the globe would be controlled by unelected, unpopular, undemocratic, self-appointed aristocrats who impose their will not only on their own people and minorities in their own territory, but then impose their will on those of other territories, right? And so of course, the spark, right, happens in the Balkans, in Serbia, when the Ottoman Empire had lost the Balkans for about 4 years. The Balkans engaged in civil war amongst one another. And so then a Congress again in Europe decided, as if it were their decision to make, that they were handing the Balkans over to Austria Hungary. And so when the Austro-Hungarian emperor sent his nephew, right, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia into Sarajevo as like a goodwill tour to the Serbian people there in the Balkans, they were killed, they were assassinated by Alexander Princip, a Serbian terrorist of the Black Hand organization of Serbia. And then when they made demands, the uncle, right, Franz Joseph, made demands that Serbia hand over all members of the Black Hand, all documentation, right, all suspects. Serbia refused because of the diplomacy of that time period, right? All these contingency alliances. If I'm attacked by this country, if I go to war with this country, will you um, be my ally? Right? In return, I promise to be your ally in the event of your worst case scenario materializing, right? All these what ifs, these contingency alliances. Woodrow Wilson supposedly was sickened by this and felt like they had an absolute, opposite effect. Then rather than deterring their enemies from messing with them, that it provoked their enemies to make their own contingency alliances that further inadvertently is going to actually lead to war rather than prevent it. And so, to some historians, that played out that way. So the Serbians, right, little Serbia, they couldn't handle the Austro-Hungarian army. So what gave them that choose paw, right, to stand up to them? Well, they had already been told, right, as a Slavic people, the Serbians had made a deal with Nicholas II of Russia, right, as a fellow Slavic country. Nicholas II promised his alliance and protection of Serbia. So uh, Austro-Hungary, right, agreed to still come in with the punitive expedition. The Russians supposedly mobilized their army first and brought it in to protect the Serbians. And you could probably guess who had the back of Austria-Hungary against the mighty Russian, at least mighty numerically, mighty Russian armed forces. Of course, Germany. The Austro-Hungarians were German cousins, ethnically, traditionally, historically, right, even institutionally, with the Germans. And so, hence, Kaiser Wilhelm II had promised to have the back of the Habsburg family of Austria. And so that brought him in. Then, with Germany coming in against Russia, you had already had a pact, right? A tripartite pact between England, France, and Russia. And England and France promised to have Russia's back should Russia ever have to fight Germany. And then, of course, right, England was intimidated and threatened by Germany because of not only the Second Industrial Revolution, but Germany openly declared through a man named von Tirpitz a naval arms race with England, and contended that they were going to outstrip England as the #1 naval power in the world. And so, and then of course, France and Germany. France arguably was behind a lot of these machinations of making alliances because she had plenty to be angry about with her German neighbor. There had been, the Franco-Prussian War. They had taken the Germans, that is, Alsace and Lorraine. They had come in into to Paris, into Paris itself during the Franco-Prussian War, looking for the prime minister and government. And so the Germans had bullied the French, and they had plenty of reasons to resent them and to try to make alliances to prevent that from happening again in the future. So that's supposedly how it spirals, right? So for 3 of the 4 years, from 1914 to 1918, they fight, right? And literally, as you see in the textbook, Woodrow Wilson ran for reelection partly under the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." He was proud of the fact that from 1914 to 1917, we did not join this war. We did not go, quote, over there, as a popular song indicated at that time. And he was proud of that, right? And he ran with that as a slogan. You have depictions of Woodrow Wilson, right? As far as just his personality, as far as primary source material of people's diaries, personal letters, interviews, right, of what they thought of Wilson. And a common complaint about him, right, was that he had sort of that proverbial intellectual smugness to him, right? That he had a PhD, he was a Princeton professor and dean, and so that he gave that air, right, supposedly in his social interactions, that he was the most intelligent man in the room, and he was quasi annoyed by all the dummies that were surrounding him. And so, and you take that with a grain of salt, but like I said, you definitely could find that accusation quite frequently in the primary sources. And so, at any rate, he conveyed that image, right? that he and the country were above this war, that the war was petty, it was fought over greed and unnecessary alliances and provocative alliances, right? Imperialism over small countries that had every right to exist on their own. And so, hence, that we were too proud to fight, as he said, right? And that we were above this, above the fray. And for a while, as far as militarily, everything went to a stalemate. The common narrative states that they had archaic or old bygone methods of attacking with cavalry, trying to outflank the enemy, right, with a feint attack here on the line, and then they go around the left or right flank, etc. And and on these general assaults, these cavalry and infantry assaults. Well, artillery in particular and ammunition had evolved by World War One, right, to the extent that it made those old school tactics semi-suicidal. And that's what they supposedly found out the hard way early in 1914 and 1915, right? Were just mass carnage on both sides whenever they attack the other. So then, right, by the middle of the war, it's commonly called a stalemate. They began to instead, right, entrench themselves literally underground with these, ensconcing themselves in these deep trenches, and and trying to wait for the enemy to take the attack first and take advantage of that rash decision. And so, like I said, early in the war, you look at Verdun, Verdun. You get look at the first battle of the Somme, Somme River, and you see some rash decisions, rash attacks, and just mass carnage. Just tens of thousands of men dying within a single afternoon. Um, and so, so at any rate, then it resolves to trench warfare, right? And with that trench warfare, they oftentimes use terms like malaise, right? That the soldiers began to become apathetic, a sense of just losing their bearings, losing their sense of purpose, living in these trenches and going crazy, going mad with the conditions they're in. And so, in come the Americans in 1917, right? And by almost all accounts of the French and English, right, the Americans, they almost kind of joke that they'd like to buy the Americans for what they're worth and sell them for what they think they're worth. That the Americans came in almost mirthful, almost filled with joy to fight, and very confident, right? You have famous quotes, right? One of the most famous ones is they were told, when they first came into I want to say it's the Cantini sector of France and fighting. And a French official told them, boys, they called us doughboys for a couple reasons, our soldiers there. And the French gentleman told them, boys, get out of here, retreat. And one of them famously said, retreat, hell, we just got here. And so that type of, almost cockiness the Americans brought to the war, right? And you look in 1917 and 1918, there were at least five just kind of ultimate counterattacks that the Germans engaged in, okay? At least five that became rather famous, and all five of them ultimately are going to fail, okay? The one supposedly where they had the best chance, they gave up early, according to historians, and that's in modern day Belgium. But what they tried oftentimes, because the significance, some people think the emotional and ego element crept in, is they wanted to take Paris, they wanted to take Paris, and they got as close as a place called Amiens, Amiens. And on two occasions, they're just miles from Paris, and the Germans lose at that city, and those were pivotal wins for the Allies. And the Americans were not very strong in number at either of those battles at Amiens. Nevertheless, on the way, a little further than that, on the way to France, right? And then later at the Meuse Argonne rivers, the United States at any given time had 1.5 million doughboys at any given time on the battlefield. We're eventually going to bring about 4 million boys over there, right? And we know from several books, one of them being a pretty respectable book, a national bestseller, The First World War by John Keegan. Okay. He has quotes from the German command as high as Erich Ludendorff himself. Ludendorff and Hindenburg were the two generals leading the German military during the war. They were given semi dictatorial powers by the Kaiser of Germany to conduct this war, right? And so one of those two, Erich Ludendorff, has direct quotes where he states that to him and to a lot of the rank and file German soldiers, American numbers gave a psychologically debilitating blow to the Germans. That when they saw, right, to me, 1914 and 1918, and we get in there in 1917, I kind of liken that, for better for worse, to a 12 round boxing match, and the Americans come in to help in the eighth or ninth round, fresh, and so our numbers alone were supposedly really had a flattening effect on the morale of the German army and the German command, thinking, oh my goodness, because they, of course, right, show evidence of being progressively concerned about their increasing inability to replace every casualty, because they only have so many men, right, that they could draft, and there are only so many young men that lived at that generation in Germany, and so they were running out of reinforcements. And so supposedly, no matter which way you look at it, American numbers did matter. We did help secure the loss of the Central Powers of Germany, right, and their decision to surrender to the Triple Entente, or to the Allied powers, at the end, in November of 1918. All right. And so why did we get involved, right? What went on during the war, etc. And so, for one, right, of course, this is somewhat, court history, right? Is that, in most historiography, it's not good to be known as a warmonger by anyone's calculations, right? And so it's best in the history books to be depicted as a guy who was pushed into war, right? The quiet guy who didn't want to fight and was forced into the fight, right? So Woodrow Wilson, right? He tried to play that role, at least, if not actually played it. And so, like I said, not only 3 of the 4 years of the war, he kept us out, but there were multiple occasions, right? There were multiple occasions in which there were violations of what were considered our international rights as a country during war. So there was a guy in the 1600s, right? And his name was Hugo Grotius, and he and other intellectuals, right, began to write about a concept called the law of nations, right, or international law. And in particular, they wrote about it, conduct during a war. That when people are fighting at war, right, that the belligerents, those officially fighting in the war, as well as the neutrals, those who are not officially involved in the war, are entitled to certain responsibilities as well as certain rights and privileges, right? And so, and by the way, this is a lot older than the 1600s and Hugo Grotius. He just began to kind of codify it in a famous book or two. The Catholic Church had practiced this for centuries, right before this. So at any rate, it kind of arguably was codified during the Crimean War, Crimean, between Turkey and Russia. There were a lot of alleged atrocities on both sides, a lot of press coverage of these atrocities. And so they had a couple conferences in which they decided on certain rules about how they were going to conduct war then and in the future. And so, at any rate, right, according to this, this tradition is what was taken as to be an axiom that you didn't question, or were a couple ones. One, right, is non-combatants are to be left alone. If you're not in a soldier's uniform, if you're not technically a belligerent in one of the countries that has declared war, you're not to be killed, right? Any more than you go to a football game and one of the helmet clad, shoulder pad clad football players runs and tackles someone out in the stands, right? It was considered inappropriate and illegal. And then secondly, another axiom that was accepted was that if you are a neutral country, you were entitled to sell non-contraband to one or more of the warring countries. And of course, as you can guess, contraband means against the list. The list included weaponry, right? Ammunition, etc. Because then you're not technically being neutral, you're helping out one side, right? Militarily. So as long as it's not war materiel, you as a neutral nation are entitled to sell your products to any or all of the warring countries, right, during the war. And that's exactly what was infringed upon during World War One, right? Is the English. They engaged in a northern central, a northern and central and western, for that matter, blockade of mainland Europe. And then when we tried to sell our food and clothing, etc., to ports that were in any way connected to Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire, the English would simply confiscate our stuff. And so they violated in that way, right? But much more dramatically, arguably, the Germans devised their famous Untersee boats, their U-boats, their submarines. And with those submarines, right, they began to engage in indiscriminate warfare. It was, it was the beginnings of sonar with vibrations. Radar won't be invented until World War II. So the conditions were somewhat primitive. And so they would have certain indications that a vessel was coming in their direction, and that's all they knew. Like you see the old Popeye movies, etc. If they came up to the surface with their periscope, that could literally mean the difference of life and death, right? Because they're betraying their location. And so what they began to do is they didn't want in certain phases of the war to take any risks for themselves. So they would indiscriminately fire at a vessel that came in a certain port, right, for one of the Allied powers. And sometimes, right, it was a mere merchant vessel. It was just a family owned or corporate owned ship that was not even armed, had nothing to do with munitions or arms, right, and was just trying to sell produce or whatever it might be. Sometimes it was a cruiser, right? The Titanic type stuff, right? Where people, especially well-to-do, are just simply engaging in a on a cruise, right? And they have nothing to do with a war, and bam, they're sunk and killed. So when you look at the famous occasions, the most famous were the Arabic, the Sussex, right? The Lusitania, of course, right? But there were several others that got less publicity. And so on these occasions, the numbers began to pile up of hundreds and hundreds of Americans, civilians, and merchants who were getting killed by these German U boats. So supposedly, right, Woodrow Wilson gives an ultimatum to the German government and tells them if they do not cease and desist with this unrestricted submarine warfare, that he was going to ask Congress to declare war and he was going to mobilize his army, right? And so they gave us the famous Sussex Pledge, promised not to do it anymore. And for a while that worked, right? And then they made a calculated decision that they were on the verge. It was just on the verge of their famous counterattacks of 1917. And they felt like they took a risk, right? With time, as they had good reason to believe that the American economy had not been militarized yet, right? The whole military industrial complex thing, right? Instead of making refrigerators and cars, they need to make tanks and airplanes, right? That it would take us a certain amount of time to change our economy and to build up our war machine, that in that amount of time, Germany could definitively end the war. And so they took that risk, right? And they re-announced, I guess you could give them credit. They at least announced it. They announced their taking back up, right? Their re-acquisition of re-implementation of unrestricted submarine warfare. And when they did, right, Wilson wasn't going to sit around and wait for another ship to be sunk. And so that's when he supposedly hesitantly asked Congress to declare war. But notice he didn't give England any ultimatums about confiscating our stuff, also in violation of international law. But you might guess his excuse, right? was that English violations took away American goods and money. German violations took away human lives, and that was much graver, he contended, right? But of course, others, like what you see in number one, contend that he was naturally more harsh against Germany, maybe even subconsciously wanted to get sucked into war against Germany because they stood for everything against his liberal Whig and progressive belief system, right? And he did not want them and their side to win. So, whatever it may be, he asked Congress to declare war, and they do so, right? And so, in the third of 4 year war, we intervened. And kind of like World War II, when we first began, we developed a negative reputation for not knowing, not being up to speed with modern warfare tactics, and we were far behind in our production and use of artillery in particular. We had to largely depend upon the French for our artillery. We had to largely depend upon the English for our tanks because our tank production was very poor, which was ironic, right? Because the tank morphed arguably from an American corporate made tractor that was used to sludge through the soil. And so, at any rate, right, uh, I want to use that to kind of morph into number two is to Woodrow Wilson, right? He contended that we were in a very precarious situation when we did enter the war, right? For several reasons. For one, he was worried about us imploding from within. A lot of German American communities really were vocal and relatively strong in their lobbyist power in the old Midwest, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis, right? And the areas around the Great Lakes. And then, I say this a bit tongue in cheek, but supposedly there's good evidence for it, is our rather large and significant lobbyist group of Irish Americans and Irish immigrants, right? Especially Boston and New York, et cetera, along the East Coast. They largely were for Germany as well, because they hated England so much. And the enemy of their enemy was their friend. And then, however, right, you had a lot of kind of WASP. Remember, WASP is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and the Angles and Saxons were the ones who took over from from Roman Britain, right? And so Anglo-Saxon is primarily intended to convey English. A lot of WASP Americans felt a sense of a xenophobia, of almost hateful fear of outsiders, right? In light of the 1890s alone, because so many new immigrants came into the country. Remember, we addressed that in our Gilded Age assignment number 2 from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were not English, they were not WASP, they were not Protestant. They were darker skinned with foreign languages and customs, right? From agricultural areas. So didn't have a lot of skills or education. They were supposedly taking jobs, right? And all the stuff we've already gone over, namely the Italians, et cetera, right? And so to Americans, you supposedly still had a pretty strong waspy, xenophobic reaction to all this immigration, whereby they were all for England and France being closer to WASP heritage, right? Winning this war as opposed to Germany. And so Americans, you could see it in the newspapers. You could see evidence of this in government, meetings of Congress and state legislators and edicts by governors, etc. That there was a bit of tumultuous debate going on as far as people having disparate passions and loyalties during this war. And then, of course, the press loves to run with stuff, right? And so you have some infamous cases of phobia of Germans in particular. A guy named Ernst Kuhnwald left a bomb in a subway and it went off. A famous German composer contended that if the German Kaiser would but tell him to kill our American president, he would, in visiting and performing musically here in the States. You had a case of an American naturalized sailor of German descent, who, in hindsight, they say his estranged wife made all this up, but she contended that he was trying to sabotage a naval yard and blow it up and so forth. And this gets lots of publicity, etc. Right? And so, for those, and then also, of course, the Lusitania and evidence of these German U-boats blowing up these ships and killing hundreds of American civilians at a time. This greatly enhanced an anti-German feeling amongst the public. You see these patriotic leagues that kind of somewhat simultaneously erupted throughout the country, and things just as as informal and locally grassroots based as like local Lions clubs and local taverns and bars and city councils began to decide that if they saw anything that smacked of treason, of disloyalty to the country, of pro-German terrorism, that they would immediately report and even punish the suspects or culprits, right? So and remember, appealing to that, I would arguably say is populist, right? To me, populism is the ugly side of democracy when you kind of cater to the irrational fears and negative emotions of your constituents, etc., right? And Wilson did. Wilson, instead of condemning these patriotic leagues, which some people were saying, right, were these xenophobic vigilante groups, he embraced them and invited them to report to the federal government any cases of sabotage and terrorism, etc. Right? And so the meaning, right, is with number two, maybe I go way too far in supporting Wilson, but I try to make an excuse for his discrepancies, right, for his hypocrisy, and saying that, okay, uh, it's one thing to be consistent as an intellectual when you're sitting in a classroom, right, standing at a lectern in Princeton, giving a lecture. Of course, right, you could analyze everything and ensure before your lecture, before your written book, that you are being ideologically consistent. But when you're president, right, you run into all kinds of variables, all kinds of problems and obstacles that don't afford you that same luxury, so that it's easy to be consistent with your own ideology and what you claim you believe in, your own rhetoric, right? But that sometimes when you become like a president, you almost have to become pragmatic instead of looking, okay, what do my belief systems dictate I should do? That in any given situation, you say, okay, what does common sense in this isolated case dictate that I should do? And in being more pragmatic and utilizing common sense, right, and isolating that moment, you're much more likely to contradict your own beliefs, right? But that hence he felt compelled to because of the circumstances. So, for instance, right, we clearly had a problem with getting our war machine going quickly enough for our 4 million doughboys, right? So, what was he to do? I stayed on number two. Go with mom and pop businesses, because that was part of his rhetoric, right? As remember, he said trusts as a progressive candidate in 1912 for president, and he won off this, right, against Teddy Roosevelt, that trusts were inherently um, parasitical and immoral, that he wanted to break up all the trusts, right? The major trusts and all the industries, and give the mom and pop businesses a second chance, right? At the American dream. But what does he do with the war? He goes to the big hated trusts. He goes to the big guys to have war contracts with them. And of course, right, he contends that it was out of necessity, that it would have been a bureaucratic mess and it would have been a long delayed nightmare to give, contracts to hundreds, if not more, mom and pop shops for his tanks and his guns and his ammunition. So we had to go to big business to get this stuff as quickly and efficiently as possible. Supposedly, right, knowing his previous rhetoric to break up big business, now he's enriching big business with these lucrative contracts, right? he's aware of the fact that he's contradicting his own rhetoric the presidential race, and so he tries to make some progressive conditions right upon it. So first of all, he put Samuel Gompers, the leader of the AFL, leading union, one of the leading labor unions of the country, right? He puts him in charge of deciding who gets a labor contract and who doesn't. So ostensibly, if you have a reputation for treating your workers poorly, Samuel Gompers will not let you get that government contract to make the guns for it, right? He also demanded that there be a minimum wage, maximum work hours, workers' compensation if you get hurt, and the rights to collectively bargain and unionize for the workers who are under these contracts, right? Who are laboring in the factories for the corporations that had a contract with the government, right? And just them. And so you see that contention. However, conservatively, he also demanded that the workers, despite these rights that were to be given to them during the war, they could not strike, right? Because of course, to him, there was there's no time to spare. So at any rate, then you also have the problem of contention. Not only what I mentioned already with different ethnic, factions in the country supporting different sides of the war, but when you look at the far left, you look at the socialist newspapers, right? A couple of them were quite incendiary, implying that the actual American should refuse the draft, right? And should, if anything, take up arms against this government here, not against the fellow workers of Germany and these other combatant countries, right? You look at the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, known informally as the Wobblies. And you could find evidence, right, of them engaging in sabotage and in violent strikes in Arizona, in Bisbee, Arizona, in Butte, Montana, in the state of Washington, right? Those are just a few examples where the Wobblies had explosions, destroyed property, used gun violence, right, etc. So hence, right, this scared the heck out of Woodrow Wilson, right? That the far left in particular was going to sabotage our war effort. So to him, right, again, he contends, and number two, that it was a necessity for him to crack down and use some somewhat coercive measures that were needed at that hour of American history. So for one, right, he engages in what's known as the Palmer raids after a guy named Mitchell Palmer, whose house blew up as a bureaucrat, and it was in hindsight still conceded that the Wobblies were probably behind it. So he gets a writ or a warrant from the Supreme Court to go after the IWW. And they went after, like in a single day, they went after like 49 wobbly offices and shut them down, arrested everybody on site, right? Kind of suspended their due process rights a little bit during the war. Remember, arguably, Abraham Lincoln did this as well during the Civil War, had done this. So at any rate, the Wobblies, they really went after them. And especially, their Fourth Amendment right to the freedom of their persons and their property, right, without a reasonable, suspicion, that arguably was kind of trounced by the Supreme Court and given this generic warrant to Mitchell Palmer in the State Department. Um, and then, of course, the state militias and these other states that I mentioned where the Wobblies were strong were given these blank checks to make mass arrests, deportations, etc. Right? There were, for instance, Mother Jones, Emma Goldman, these other women that were connected to immigrant groups and radical organizations, right, on the far left, who wanted the overthrow of the capitalist system here, etc. Some of them were deported back to Russia and back to Europe during the war at this time by Wilson's administration. So he cracked down on the left, right, on the far left. And then, of course, he created the committees of or not the committees of correspondence. That's a Revolutionary War. Where am I going with that? Let me share this again. Sorry. Shame on me for forgetting. Let's go to number 2. Basically his propaganda machine, say revisionist historians, right? Were the, come on. We're going to get to those in just a moment. The Espionage Act and the Carl Schenck case. But the, come on. Sorry. Where are you? Espionage Act. The CPI, the Committee on Public Information. The CPI basically was a an organization, right, that engaged in a propaganda movement, right, where they had 4-minute speeches given between the changing of reels at the movie theaters. About 75,000 speeches were given in a single year. Um, they had over 1 million pieces of literature that were passed out. And if you even just Google CPI, you'll get the infamous, extreme cases of a gorilla wearing the German Kaiser's like Hong Kong, King Kong, wearing the Kaiser's helmet, and he has American Lady Liberty in his arms, right? And he's taken her away forcefully. And so it sometimes came down to just blatant propaganda, right? Of trying to depict the German army in particular as being barbaric and inhuman, etc. Right? And so you find plenty of evidence of that in the CPI. And remember, this is coming from a guy who stood for intellectual autonomy of all Americans, right? For them to think for themselves. He's a Princeton intellectual, right? And here he is engaging in this crude propaganda campaign with the CPI, trying to get American sentiment against the Central Powers, namely Germany, and for the American war effort. And not to mention, it was tied to rationing. By the end of the war, we began rationing in a few products. One of them was sugar and certain foods, etc. Right? And so, in addition to that, although he himself was not directly behind these other two examples you see here, he definitely endorsed them. He supported them. And one was the Carl Schenck case. Carl Schenck, right, was arrested for having protest literature and standing out at a corner telling people to not answer the draft and to rise up, if anything, against their government. He was arrested, right? And as you might guess, he pled the First Amendment in his own defense. The Supreme Court decided against him in conservative fashion. It's one of our known limitations to our First Amendment rights, right? And they contended that if your words or expression create an environment of clear and present danger, you cannot express those words. So hence you can't yell bomb on an airplane and get everybody panicked and cause, a melee of people stampeding one another. You can't do that to this day, right? So the clear and present danger clause has been in effect since this time of World War I. And of course, President Wilson, despite his pro, individual rights rhetoric, was for this and endorsed it and said it was necessary. And then even more, arguably more um, controversial than that were the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The Espionage Act, right, is that any behavior or expression that encouraged insubordination or impeded the war effort, right, kept the army from being able to draft people, etc. Right, was to be declared unconstitutional and no longer in your First Amendment uh, purview of rights. Was it Yesenia? Did you have a question, hon? Or anyone for that matter? All right, so just let me know. Just chime in if you do, if and when you do. But notice, right, how ironic. This guy is for individual rights. He's anti big business. He's for the autonomy of every individual to think for his or herself, right? And then he becomes president and he makes contracts with big business. He crushes down on freedom of expression, on the far left at least, right? He issues a propaganda campaign. He drafts our boys, obviously, right? And forces them to go fight. And so many ironies with this man. as this proclaimed liberal, does so many conservative things during his presidency, and how much was necessitated by the war and the realities during the war, that's for you to decide. But on number two, right, there clearly is sympathy for him trying to defend his contradictions as to him being perceived to be necessary under the circumstances. All right. And if you'll indulge me a couple more examples, then I'm going to open it up to questions, and I'm kind of finished. Couple other examples, if you'll indulge me, is another one was in Latin America, right? He was for the autonomy of all peoples, he said, right? For people in all countries, all ethnic groups. He wasn't. He generically called them nationalities. Technically, right? That's part of a man-made artificial entity known as a modern nation state, right? But some of them were not part of nation states. They were part of these, international empires, and he called them nationalities nevertheless, and entitled to their own government. So I think I hope that I'm not misspeaking for him, is I think he interchangeably used notions of nationality and ethnicity together under this term nationality. That's my take on it subjectively. So at any rate, when he talks about different ethnicities and nationalities being entitled to rule themselves, right? You look at Latin America, for instance. Teddy Roosevelt, remember, issued the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the amendment or addition to the Monroe Doctrine. The initial Monroe Doctrine of 1823 had told the European powers to stay out of Latin America. His corollary was directed toward the Latin Americans, not the Europeans, and said, you must be financially responsible and politically stable, or else we, the United States, are going to come and intervene and clean house for you so the Europeans don't, right? Woodrow Wilson, according to his own rhetoric, should have opposed that kind of, paternalism, like we're the dad over these countries, right? But nevertheless, he carried it out. So, for instance, in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, there were dramatic episodes. Haiti, a crowd of people supposedly tore the prime minister of Haiti to pieces. So we sent in troops and ordered an election for them to resume, to let the people's will of Haiti decide who they want to rule them next, and to have a peaceful transition of government, right? The Dominican Republic, I can't remember the details, but something almost equally dramatic happened, and we sent troops there. But in Haiti, right, they decided upon a winner, and we left. We sent our troops away, right? But then the next guy quit. He resigned before his term was done, and civil war ensued. And so we sent troops back. We had another election, and we kept soldiers there. Him contending that the Haitian people were not ready to be independent at that time. And so, hence, right, he always had an excuse for an instance in which he violated his own rhetoric. And Haiti was no different. And he did the same with Mexico. With Mexico, right? At first, the the revolution, the Mexican Revolution of 1910, is one of the most infamous and iconic events of Mexican history. And so Porfirio Diaz had ruled for about 30 years, somewhat with an iron hand. And he finally, as an elderly leader, is chased out of the country. And then you literally have at least 6 parties that were vying militarily and politically to become the next leader, and fighting one another. So you had, Pancho Villa up in the north. You had Carranza up in the north, right? You had Emiliano Zapata in the south, and several other people, including a guy named Francisco Madero in the south. So they're all fighting it out, right? And momentarily, Madero takes over. Madero promises to have a liberal constitution with checks and balances and human rights embedded in that constitution, as well as a general election, because he felt confident that he would be elected as the next president, right? So he hit the criteria, arguably, at least relative to the other Mexican, they call them caudillos, these local leaders, right? These natural people that people naturally looked up to in their regions of Mexico as their leaders. So he arguably, amongst all the Mexican caudillos, um, hit Wilson's criteria the best of being a good liberal and progressive. So Wilson gives him his endorsement. No sooner does that happen that the leader of the military under Madero, uh, oh, don't fail me now. Is it Juarez? Oh, shame on me. Um, I have it somewhere in my notes. Give me just a moment. I can't believe I'm forgetting his name. But at any rate, a gentleman, right, leading the military institutes a coup, a COUP, right, a blow to the state, and arrests the president, the interim president, Francisco Madero. So, that's as old school as you can get, right? The leader of the military overthrowing the civilian government, etc. So, what happens is President Woodrow Wilson makes and gives an ultimatum to this gentleman, right? And says, you are to step down immediately to release Francisco Madero, and you are to allow free and fair elections for the next Mexican president. Well, this gentleman does not do so. He refuses to do so, and he even goes a step further. He has Francisco Madero executed. So, in addition to that, there was something known as the Tampico episode, Tampico, whereby American sailors had problems with their ship. So they went into Tampico to get help at the port, and they were captured by this gentleman's military, some of them tortured and beaten up and roughed up before they were finally released. So, with those two instances, Woodrow Wilson sent in Marines to Veracruz, Mexico, for a short invasion to punish as a punitive symbol against this kind of warlord of Mexico. And also, they contended that it was about money as well, and they would take over the customs office and get American money back. But it was a bit of a fiasco, and he retreated the Marines not very long after they invaded. But then, secondly, because this gentleman is not going to last, um, he uh, he had endorsed both Carranza and Madero, right? Not knowing who would win. Wilson had endorsed and even given arms and money to both these caudillos up in the north of Mexico. And then at the moment of truth, he chose Carranza. And Carranza, in many ways, did not hit his criteria. And you see a much more practical and a bit hypocritical side of Wilson, giving his money to Carranza, because Carranza ruled like an old school feudal lord there in the Chihuahua and Coahuila area of northern Mexico. But nevertheless, he felt like he was the winning horse. So Wilson revoked his help for Pancho Villa and continued to give it to Carranza instead. Pancho Villa was defeated by Carranza in a major battle, and Pancho Villa was furious and felt betrayed by Wilson and the American government for retracting their help. So he crossed the border of Mexico to a place called Columbus, New Mexico, to try to take on the soldiers at that fort. And instead, he mainly fought American civilians who saw this marauding army of Mexican bandidos, if you will, crossing into their territory. And they came out with guns, and about 21 of them were killed by Pancho Villa and his men. So, for a second time, Woodrow Wilson sent Marines into Mexico looking this time for Pancho Villa to capture, arrest, and punish him. And of course, they had no luck in that, and it didn't happen. So ironically, right, Mr. Sovereignty of all people, self-determination of all people, he never let go of Puerto Rico. He did, in his defense, put the Philippines on a timeline whereby in a certain number of years they would be released and have their independence. But he didn't let go of Puerto Rico. He did not let go of Guam as a military island from the Spanish-American War. And he also did not. He also had Mexico invaded twice and brought in troops to the Dominican Republic and Haiti, right, under Teddy Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and kept troops in Haiti even after the second election. So notice in so many cases, right, this guy, he violates his own rhetoric. What he claimed to stand for before he was president and what he did later as president were largely at odds with each other. Any comments from anybody? Not at all? Are you guys still with me? You guys okay?
Yeah, I can't think of anything.
Okay, that's okay. Long as you're with me.
Yep.
Yep, we're here.
Good, good. That's great to hear. All right. So just kind of FYI, a couple other things about Wilson before we end here, unless you have any other comments or questions, is for one, as a progressive, as someone who claimed to be progressive as our president, right? There are just a couple things largely related to him with the progressive movement. Well, for one, right, there was a graduated income tax, and progressives wanted that, right? They wanted, especially because remember, they wanted bigger government and they wanted to help out the marginalized and the less fortunate, right? And so they needed income, they needed a source of revenue. And remember, with graduated, the higher income bracket you're in, not only the more money, right? Because 7% of a million is higher than 7% of 100,000. Not only the more money you're extracting from these wealthy people and their income, but they even wanted to do a higher percentage, right? Almost punitively, say the conservatives, right? Against the rich because they had that money to spare. So a graduated income tax was implemented under his presidency. Also, the Federal Reserve. And believe it or not, this big national bank system was seen as progressive because it took power away from Wall Street and the bankers of New York, right? The purely private bankers who were seen as parasites and harmful to the economy at large. Now you had government oversight, right? So, for instance, uh, instead of being located just in New York City, there are 12 regional centers, right, throughout the country and all the major regions of the United States with the Federal Reserve. If you are uh, to uh, to sign up with the Federal Reserve, and of course, the great um, perk of that is that they would subsidize you. They would keep you, afloat in tough times, right? If you join the Federal Reserve System as a private banker, but in doing so, you have responsibilities to the Federal Reserve. They get to look through your paperwork and to see if you're engaged in some kind of white collar crime and you're defrauding your investors or depositors in any way. They even get to dictate terms, right? As far as saying, okay, we're going to grant you this much money, right? Or this kind of loan, provided that you give a certain number of loans that are under 150,000 to small first time would be business owners, right? They do things such as that. And so that's what supposedly makes it a progressive measure, this Federal Reserve System. And and then also, right, the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act was to some people deliberately stated as vaguely as possible and just stated, right, there shall be no combinations or conspiracies in constraint of competition and trade. That's all they said, right? His Clayton Act that Congress passed largely with his promotion of it, right? Clayton. His Clayton Antitrust Act gave a long list of specific examples of violations of the antitrust law. So price gouging, price conspiracies, joining governing boards. It gives all these specifics, right? So now to this day, right, looking at the Clayton Act, the antitrust law is very much more easily enforceable, right? Because the attorneys can go to court and say, look, it's right here on the list, and they clearly are in violation of doing that very thing, right? On explicitly stated on this list. So that's what he was largely known for as far as his progressive legislation of his time. All right. And then also by the end of the war, right? By the end of the war, He was famous for his famous 14 points. Okay. He wanted a new world order. He wanted a new organization of the world, if you will, that was freer, more fair, filled with more justice and equity for more and more people, right? Allowed more independence and autonomy to more peoples of the world, right? But also would be less amenable to future wars, right? Because he felt certain things had led to World War I, and he didn't want to see those things happen again. So, for instance, most famously, I would argue, is his notion of self determination. He wanted all countries, right, to be able to determine themselves their own leaders, their own leadership, their own government, their own national destiny without an outsider imposing his or her will on them. So, as you might guess, right, he wanted the Austro Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire to be broken up. He wanted them to be broken up and to allow self determination to all those subjugated peoples. So, right, to him, right, the Ottomans ought to allow the Lebanese, the Jordanians, the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Moroccans, the Tunisians, right? Let them have their own countries. Let them have their own governments and not be held by a Turkish sultan any longer. So Austria-Hungary, he wanted the Balkans to be left alone, right? Let the Serbians, the Croatians, the Albanians have their own autonomy there in Southern Europe, have their own governments, etc. Right? He wanted freedom of the seas. So, because after all, right, that's what ostensibly sucked us into the war, is our freedom of the seas, right, as a neutral country, was infringed upon. And he also wanted an international organization of states, of countries, right, that would arbitrate disputes, right? And remember, arbitrate is like referee disputes. So if two countries were diplomatically about to, dissolve diplomacy and mobilize their armies, that some international board, right, with an international board of judges in particular, that had authority that was recognized throughout the globe, could make a mandate or more, right, demands of one or two of those countries to keep them from going to war. If one country invaded another smaller, weaker sovereign country, that international body step in and defend that smaller, weaker country. And of course, in addition to being able to add to international law, to make judicial decisions throughout the world, they were to have military muscle behind them to enforce it, have an international army. So, of course, this predates, right, the UN, the United Nations, and the military wing of it, NATO, right, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization of armies. So he was for all this, right? But he comes in, and according to the accounts, they met at Versailles, right? The famous place of Louis XIV of France, right? They met at Versailles, France, and he was perceived as an upstart Johnny come lately, right? Like, wait a minute, we just fought 4 years and lost over 10 million men. You came in the third of the 4 years, and you want to dictate to us what terms we're going to have here at this treaty? I don't think so, right? Not to mention his reputation for rubbing people the wrong ways, personality wise. So, at any rate, needless to say, in many ways, he didn't succeed. He did not invite a single Republican to Versailles, supposedly, as a Democratic president. And the Republicans had gained, I believe, the majority by the end of his second term of the Senate. And constitutionally, they have to approve of any treaties that the president signs. And so the Republicans kept that from happening. And we did not agree to the Versailles Treaty. And we had like a separate peace. And so we did not join this League of Nations that they established. A way in which his vision did not materialize, okay? A couple ways, if you'll indulge me, I'm almost done. Is one, he wanted no punitive measures toward anybody besides making them lose their empires, right? Their sovereign independent countries that they had taken over. Of course, he wanted them to let go of those countries, but besides that, not to be penalized in any way. Well, especially the French and other diplomats at this Versailles Treaty were in rather, not to oversimplify it, but in a rather vindictive mood, if you will. They took 10% of German lands, albeit some of them were arguably sovereignly belonged to other people. They formed modern day Czechoslovakia out of some of those lands and modern day Poland out of some of those lands. But to show the complexity of it, some of those areas in Czechoslovakia and in Poland, now declared independent as new countries, had German-speaking, German culture-adhering people in those territories, which of course Hitler is gonna cry, right, and expound upon when he becomes the leader in 33. So at any rate, but they brought Germany down to 100,000-man army. They made them sign the war guilt clause. I think it was Article 251, saying that they were responsible for World War I, which is a stretch by any historian's estimation, right? That they were to pay a currently unannounced, undecided amount of money as war reparations to the winning side. And of course, Hitler is going to run against this and happen to pay these war reparations. They demilitarized the Rhineland between England and France, and they put an international army there on German soil. When Germany failed to make her reparation payments, they brought in an international army into the Ruhr, R-U-H-R, the Ruhr Valley that was rich in coal in Germany, and they began taking their coal instead of further humiliation. And so, Wilson was not for any of this, and it happened nevertheless. He was outnumbered, right? And again, America did not join the very League of Nations that was his baby. Okay. And also Article 10. Article 10 stipulated, right, that the winners did not have to give up their empires and grant self-determination to their subjugated people. Now, if that's not hypocritical, conveniently hypocritical, I don't know what is. So hence, right, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Ottoman Empire have to give up their empires and grant, independence or autonomy to these new nation states of peoples, right? But England gets to hold on to her empire. England keeps India, South Africa, right? Scotland, Canada, Australia, etc. America kept, for the time being, Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, right? France kept, I believe at that time, still Tunisia and some of North Africa. And so very hypocritical, right? Under Article 10, the winners got to keep their international empires and did not have to give them up to self-determination. So needless to say, some of the latest data that I've been sharing, which you might already be familiar with, is going to be directly attributable by historians to World War II, right? And forming a great grievance in Nazi Germany and a sense of defiance toward the League of Nations. And of course, we did not treat African Americans. We're not going to integrate them until the Korean War of the 1950s. And so, needless to say, Black troops had to fight under white separately as segregated units, still called Buffalo Soldiers at this time, under white military commanders. There was a gentleman named Ferdinand Foch, F-O-C-H, a French commander over the Allied forces, and our guy Pershing, Pershing, was very resentful about that. He wanted Americans to fight under American commanders and separate as a separate army, which did not happen. And so there was a lot of resentment, right? So initially, Pershing gave our black buffalo soldiers to Foch instead. And ironically, right, what was meant as a pejorative, harmful, disrespectful symbol act by Pershing and the American War Command ended up for the betterment of the African American soldiers, because they got to fight with the French soldiers and under French officers who treated them in a much more egalitarian manner as equals. And so they're going to come back from France, right? And a lot of people are going to tie that to the great movement into urban northern cities, and also to the NAACP and the Harlem Renaissance at the end of World War One. That it's going to enhance the expectation of these black soldiers and what they expect back at home after the war. Our American soldiers, Woodrow Wilson was in that way a typical kind of uptight progressive. He wanted the American soldiers' morality to be defended, so he fought as well as he could, arguably, against prostitution and drinking amongst the soldiers, and neither of them was enforced very effectively. And the common claim was that the American doughboys lost their innocence over in France. All right, and so are there any questions? Any questions or comments that you guys have derived from today? Are we kind of all on the same page? It's kind of all kind of self-explanatory.
I think it's good.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So I do have one question.
Yeah.
My mom is a big history person, and just in passing today, I mentioned to her that we were studying Woodrow Wilson today, that I kind of looked over the stuff we were going to be reading, and she goes,
Sure.
"Oh, he was a jerk." But he doesn't sound, from what you're saying, he kind of sounds reasonable. So what, do you have any idea why she would say that?
Well, like I said, for one, people are critical because regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the motives, it's very clear that he violated a lot of his own acclaimed principles, right? That he kind of went back on his word in many instances. But secondly, like I said, when you look at the primary sources of people in his own cabinet, of other international diplomats during World War One, of course, of his political opponents, which is pretty commonplace, right? Amongst political components, you got to consider the source. But like I said, they very often depicted him as not being, being the opposite of gregarious and affable, right? Like, to me, gregarious, you're comfortable around other people. You socially interact in a healthy, friendly manner, right? Affable, you're kind of joyful and bubbly and kind of fun and filled with mirth to be around. Nothing is said, hardly ever, but the opposite of that with Woodrow Wilson. That he was kind of uptight, a bit hypocritical, very critical of other people, carried himself like he was more righteous and more intelligent than everybody else in the room. And so, yeah, I mean, you just get that. And what's so interesting to me is those very depictions of him being so arrogant and smug, right? Um, Two things. For one, even at that same period, you get revisionist biographies that suggest, I should say, that there was a lot of insecurity that he was hiding under that facade, right? And then secondly, his humiliation after his two strokes. He lived a while after having two major strokes that physically debilitated him, and it's pretty sad when you read about his interactions after that and his second term ending, and now he becomes an ex-president, and he really, the poor guy had to eat a good dose of humble pie toward the end of his life. So I don't know if I really answered your question.
Well, so I'm sort of. I should ask her why she thinks that. But yeah, just like from what you just said about him, like he just sounds that he was supposed to be more liberal, but he was kind of more conservative.
Yes. Yes. And so that almost is without, like I said, that almost is without contradiction or even debate. And so the question arises, right, is why? What's the explanation behind that contradiction, right? Did power get to his head? Did he change and become more conservative in age? Um, did, like I did with number two, right, in a very sympathetic thesis that may or may not be going too far, did he feel, right, like the circumstances he was in almost coerced him, almost forced him, right, to go in a different direction once he was president?
I like how you kind of give us both sides.
Well, thank you. I
Yeah.
tried.
I in some of the, I've read some of the stuff and it's, well, I've read it all, but I like how you come from, give both sides of the coin. You're not just, this person was all this way. I mean, you, especially last week, I really noticed that we kind of got kind of the whole picture. I
I
like that.
appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I definitely, like I said, I know that is my genuine intention because I think any instructor at any level, I mean, to me, how much more even at the grand universities, the bona fide professors, how much more should they do that to encourage critical thinking, independent thought of the students, let them see as many sides as possible and facets to every topic, and make sense of the data themselves.
Yeah.
So thank you. That just encourages me all the more to do that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really helpful and it's nice to see, both sides of someone's personality or the situation and not see all just a liberal side or just a conservative side or just, it gives us a chance to think of but where someone could be coming from all the way around.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
That encourages me. Well, good, you guys. So anybody else, anything that you guys would like to end with before we say goodbye for
I have like a question slash comment.
sure.
Is it possible that he was trying to come off more liberal to get elected and then his more conservative side
Oh
came out?
goodness, yes. I say that not necessarily because I personally believe that, but because I had failed to mention that, and that is very often put in history books. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Matter of fact, they try to convey, right, that especially when he was beginning as a politician, as a governor of New Jersey, that he sensed the popularity of this progressive movement, right,
Mhm.
and neoliberalism, and he knew he had the political instinct to jump on that wave, right, and ride it.
Yeah.
In 1912, when he went against Teddy Roosevelt, the common parlance is that they tried to out progressive each other, right? That they knew as a given that the sentiment, the mood of the country was very progressive in that year, at that time, and so they knew that that was the way to get elected, was to try to
Mhm.
seem more progressive than the other, and it further, perhaps to Wilson, it further enhanced that assumption by seeing how poorly Taft did, because Taft ran in a more conservative platform, and
Right.
he wasn't even in the race at all. It was definitely just between Wilson and Roosevelt.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that. That is found very often uh, in history
Yeah.
books. Absolutely. So good point. Right? Anybody else?
No, I'm just following along today.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, like I said, I don't have to say it. You guys are a great class. I enjoyed this class. I look forward to seeing what you have to say, questions you have. Um, and so, but yeah, if there's nothing else, you guys, that's all I have for today. hopefully I've helped you, kind of
Well,
organize
I have a
the
question.
manner by which you look at this stuff.
Will you be covering about the test today?
Yes.
Okay.
Uh-huh. So yeah, matter of fact, we just have one more subject. We're just doing the roaring 20s, and then we'll have test 2. So by all means, I have test 2 on there, right? I believe I just finally put it on.
Yes.
Yeah, so take a look at test 2. That's the exact test you'll be taking in a couple weeks. But yes, the week of the test, as you'll have from Monday to Sunday night, right? That Wednesday afternoon, I'll be happy to go through the test.
Okay. You may get an email from me. I don't know if you saw it today. I was freaking out because the dashboard was down. Like, did anybody else see that? Try to log in? It was like the
No,
whole
sure.
server was shut down today for school for about an hour.
Really?
No.
Yeah, and I'm
Yeah.
like, oh my God, can't I have history today? So I emailed you through the email.
Oh, well, I'm glad it worked out. Yeah, I don't know if it's completely independent of that or if it's somehow tied to it, but actually mine was yesterday afternoon.
Oh,
I was
really?
unable to log on to anything, and I had to call MJC,
That's what I was
and
doing.
and I had to give myself a new password.
Oh, really? Because
Yeah, so
mine
I don't
was
know if that's tied to
saying
it or not.
it said timeout, gateway timeout. It kept saying in any browser I was in, and even on my phone off the internet, it wouldn't work. So I was freaking out. So if you get that email later, just remember it was from weeks ago
You
today.
got it. You got it. No problem. All right.
Okay.
I don't
So
know. I
yeah.
have trouble logging on to the Zoom sometimes. And so I
Uh-huh.
have my son help me, and he was gone. So he got
Oh,
home at
shoot.
like 4, and I'm like, I need your help. You have to help me right now. Because,
It's nice living with a techie, isn't it?
right, he's 14, so he understands all of it.
That makes sense. It absolutely does. That
So I
age.
was like, get home right now. And he stopped it in and out with my mom. And I'm like, I need you home so you can help me get into class because I don't want to miss it. So that's why I was late.
That makes me feel better, Aaron.
Yes.
I'm in the same boat.
Yeah, the kids have to help. Even my 10-year-old tried to help and he couldn't get it either.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I could. I sort of helped.
I didn't copy everything the right way to put it into. I don't know. It didn't work out for me. I got it though. I made it.
Good.
I know. I was looking for you, Aaron. I was like,
I know.
what?
I know. I love this class and I like did not want to miss it. And yeah.
Okay, so one funny thing, I'm late for everything that I do. It doesn't matter where I go, what I do. But this class, I've logged in the first 3 times at 3 o'clock.
Oh, yeah.
Here. Oh,
shoot.
a half hour early. Oh, okay.
Just to make sure you're not late.
Never happens. My mom says I'll be late for my own funeral because I'll be Or no, she says that's the only time I'd be on time because somebody else would be doing it. That's how the story went. What?
That's right.
Okay. Well, bye everyone.
Bye. See you next
Thank
week.
you.
All
Thank
right,
you,
thanks.
everyone. Okay. Thank you for hanging in there. You guys take care.
Thanks, you too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. Hasta la vista.
All right.